This is your host, Mark Lieberman, of the radio show The World According to Mark, brought to you through WPVM FM in Asheville, North Carolina, and streaming to you also on WPVMFM.org. My guest today is Associate Professor of Jewish Studies and Director of Jewish Studies at the University of South Carolina. I was going to say her name first. Her name is Federica Schoeman, and I want to welcome Federica to being a guest on the show.
Thank you so much. It's a privilege to be here.
And here is virtual, as they say. So we're going to start out finding out a little bit more about what you do in terms of the Jewish Studies program. And then we're going to talk about some specific topics relevant to the Holocaust. But first, let me say, again, you are not only a professor, but you have written a lot of articles. I think you might even have a script that you were writing, but I'll let you talk about that. Just tell us about you and your, in terms of your position at the University of South Carolina.
Yeah, I am a professor of Jewish studies, and in particular, my scholarship is centered on the Holocaust. But I also work on the kind of modern Jewish cultural production as a whole. So I've written and I teach Jewish humor in America. But then very often, I always just return over and over to the issue of the Holocaust as my main interest and my main, the center of my research. So, and I teach classes on the Holocaust in South Carolina. It's very interesting. I moved to South Carolina from New York City, and teaching, Jewish studies in New York City is obviously very, very different than doing it in the South. And it's been quite an experience, and it's wonderful. I hope it helps to make a little bit of a difference too.
Well, we can hear your Bronx accent from the time that you spent in New York City. Kidding, of course. So since it's on display, you might as well say where else you've lived before coming to the United States.
Yeah, I have. Yeah, this is my Upper West Side accent. So I was born in Rome, Italy. And the accent is because I was schooled a little bit in my teenage years in London, and so that's where I learned the language. But I'm not an English native speaker, so I apologize for the mistakes I still make. And I lived in a little bit all over Europe, but in particular, my most formative years, I'd say, were intellectually speaking, were the 4 or 5 years I spent in Poland. Going there to university in Warsaw and Krakow, researching Jewish life in Poland. And so I speak a few languages.
You're doing very well with the language you're speaking presently. So let's actually, sort of jump into it a little bit. We know that you're, again, the director of Jewish Studies now at University of South Carolina. And you mentioned Holocaust. I mentioned Holocaust. I think sometimes people don't really understand where that word came from, what it means. And of course, it's being used today, sometimes inappropriately, some would argue, to refer to other kinds of, quote, atrocities that maybe bear very little resemblance to what is referred to as the Holocaust. Growing up Jewish and growing up knowing about the Holocaust, I never bothered until scheduling the show to wonder where does that word come from? What does it mean? There are other words that I hear being used, Shoah being another word, but what can you tell us about the terminology and what it denotes and what it connotes?
Yeah, I'm glad to talk about it because it's actually, as you said, it's the origin of the word has been lost. And when I ask my students what the word Holocaust means, actually, they don't know. They don't know. And I do this every semester. I just ask out of curiosity, like, do you know the word? And so it's actually, it's interesting. In theoretically, I'm against the use of the word Holocaust. In Europe and Israel, Shoah is the go-to term to describe the, the massacre, the genocide of the Jews during World War II. I end up using the word Holocaust. It works, it works. That's the word that has become, the
ingrained in what we talk about.
It works, and we need it very much, because until we had a word to describe the genocide of the Jews during World War II, in a way, it didn't happen, quote unquote. If you don't have a word for things exist as long as they are named. If they're not named, they don't exist. So immediately after the war, the survivors of the Holocaust, if you say, well, what happened? Well, I was over there. It happened during the war. It was the war, but it wasn't a war. Genocide is not a war. And that's why genocide is so much worse, because it's not a war. It was, it was a war within the war. And we absolutely need a term to describe each situation, each one of these horrible events, because if we don't have a word for them, a rubric, a title, whatever you want to call it, it's as if they didn't exist, they didn't happen. We don't. So Holocaust is great as long as we have a term that brings our minds immediately to, oh, I know what that is. Now, whether it is the best possible word for it is a different story. In terms of who invented it, we don't know. We actually don't know who was the first one to call the Holocaust. I once interviewed, I used to be a journalist for many years before I became a professor. And I talked to Elie Wiesel, the Peace Nobel Prize and author and Holocaust survivor. And one day we were having brunch, and he told me that he was the first one to use the word Holocaust during a radio interview when he was still teaching at City College in New York. He, he was explaining what happened to him during the war, and he called it a Holocaust. I don't know if this is true. I don't know. All I know is that that was his sense, that he was the first one to use this word. Fine. So we don't know that. But what does the word Holocaust actually mean? It's central here, because Holocaust with the lowercase h is a very old word. It goes back thousands of years, and it's a Greek word, and it refers to the religious rite of a offering at the temple, a burning of an offering to the gods in a temple. So then the Holocaust with capital H, now today we know it as being, again, the term for the genocide of the Jews. So yes, of course, the whole idea of associating the burning and the flames with the Holocaust is very obvious because of the concentration camps, the death camps, the ovens, and the burning of the corpses. But when we really think about it, and that's kind of that's my beef with it, with the term, if we unpack the term, so in the modern scenario, if we use the word Holocaust, does it mean that then that makes the Jews the offering to the gods, and then the holy priest would be the Nazis doing the offerings, and the temple the concentration camp? So the term, when we actually look at what that originally means, is very problematic. I understand it works. Again, as I said, we need a term for it, but it does bother me a little bit that it might not be a good term. It just brings up religion. We should not be associated with the Holocaust that way. It brings up, again, actually a ritual, a religious ritual that has got nothing to do with the Holocaust itself. So then there is the word Shoah, which is a Hebrew term, and it's roughly, it translates into English as the disaster. And I think it appears only twice in the Hebrew Bible, in Torah. And that's a more neutral. It still comes, of course, from a religious background, from the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, to the Christians. But it doesn't have the connotation, the same connotation that the Greek term Holocaust has. In Yiddish, there is another term that also means the disaster, which is the Hurban, but no one uses Yiddish anymore because of the Holocaust itself. So few Yiddish speakers are alive. So yeah, so that's actually what that word Holocaust means.
Okay, so as you say, there are a lot of words that we use and people have used through history that originate with the different meaning, and then through the years and through usage or misusage. The word that always strikes me today as being misused, there are two of them, but one of them is awesome. When people use the word awesome today, I'm old enough to remember that that term was reserved for something that was really extreme, not just, okay, thank you very much for the latte. So, true enough that the term Holocaust is, has developed connotations based upon how it's been used. Curiously, though, as you mentioned, when we talk about the Holocaust, it adds another element of, questioning, I guess. Is that to say that there's only been one Holocaust and it's the Holocaust? And again, I don't think we want to go into that too deeply on this show, but a lot of the folks who are either Holocaust deniers or minimize the extent of the Holocaust, the extent of the atrocities committed during that epoch, would suggest that, it's the concept of Holocaust is too strong a term. And these kinds of things, I'm not trying to paraphrase anybody in particular, happen in all wars. Well, again, anybody that's studied, as you have, the Holocaust knows that, yes, there have been killings and murders, and ethnic cleansing is another term that comes up a lot throughout recorded history, unfortunately. But there are certain things about the Holocaust which are very specific. And again, people will also remind us and remind people that are studying the Holocaust that it wasn't just, quote, Jews that were killed by the Nazi regime. Others who were considered less than human, be they gypsies or homosexuals or whatever, they were also caught up. But the one thing we do know, again, for anybody who's even casually looked at what happened during World War II, is there was a campaign to get rid of all of the Jews that were living in Germany and in the European countries that were taken over before before World War II and the German occupation of those countries ended. So that's the Holocaust. And you teach it, you write about it. What can you say about why it has become such an important part of your professional life?
Yeah, and sorry, just before I answer your question, I just want to tell you, because you're saying something really interesting about the uses and misuses of the terminology. I'm all for, how can I say, titles and rubrics. I approve of that. But you are right, and I agree that when people use the word Holocaust to, apply to a number of other things, at bottom, perhaps their intention is of diminishing the importance of the Jewish genocide. I think, the umbrella category is genocide, and there are various genocides and ethnic cleansing, and then each people, each group, each situation can have its own rubric, its own name. Hats off to whoever finds a great, permanent, wonderful way of referring to each one of them. But the Holocaust is the Holocaust we know, and it's the Holocaust of the Jews. If everything is a Holocaust, nothing is a Holocaust. And of course, it's very problematic when it gets kind of, just thrown around for other things, and not to take away from the importance and gravity of the other immoral, illegal,
horrible examples
of Yeah, but unfortunately, I too kind of, raise a kind of an eyebrow every time I hear that, like, oh, here we go again. It's got to do with anti-Semitism. And anti-Semitism is exactly the reason why I became who I am today. I mean, why my interest in the Holocaust, which answers actually your question directly. I grew up, I was a child in the 1970s, a teenager in the 80s. In Europe, I have known anti-Semitism all my life. I grew up in a society that was not diverse, very xenophobic and anti-Semitic. I mean, anti-Semitism has not died with the end of World War II. I mean, the Holocaust itself, the genocide ended. It's a parenthesis, but it's part of such a larger and enormously larger phenomenon of hate, particularly against the Jews. And that was there, unchanged after the war. And so I grew up in the places of the Holocaust. I've heard about it all my life. I was telling yesterday to my Holocaust class, I was teaching them, and they were asked me actually a very similar question. And I was explaining to them that in my generation, parents were much less delicate than today, much less prepared to protect children, and we knew everything. We knew what happened. I am the first one born in the generation born after the war. I mean, my parents were all pre-war. I mean, my family. So people were there, were surrounding us. The places of the killings, of the disappearances, were all around us. We really knew what happened, to the most horrible details. And it was very traumatic, and it stayed with me. When I was 10 years old or so, a kid in school, a friend, let's say, a peer in class, beat me up with an umbrella until the umbrella broke. And he was screaming this horrible stuff in Italian, oh, giusto the ovens will get rid of you. And we're just hitting me. And I mean, was that traumatic? No, it's just a kid beating me up for being Jewish. But, it says something. It's sort of like, oh, and when my parents the day after brought me to the principal, who was a man, this very large man in his office smoking, his conclusions were, oh, he's got a crush on her. That's what boys do when they have a crush on women, which brings us to another very dear subject matter of mine, of how we treat women and how we, explain the violence against women or against vulnerable people. So yeah, it's and that's really the world I grew up in, a world where even my friends, I particularly from high school to college to university, we were all leftist. We were all like, world-loving peaceniks, except that my friends really hated, again, even the most leftist, most other-oriented of my friends hated the Jews and hated Israel. And I've always felt that so strongly. It's always been painful. It's been demeaning. It's been discouraging. I just grew up with that. And so I just kept learning, studying it. I thought that by writing about it, by teaching it, maybe I could make a difference. I could bring a different voice into the discourse. And that's why I became who I am.
Well, we're going to talk about this because I do think that you bring a different voice to the topic. But my guest today is Federica Schoeman, who is the Director of Jewish Studies at the University of South Carolina. And we've just been talking about the concept and the name, the Holocaust, and talking about how that term has been used or potentially misused, and your involvement or your recognition of anti-Semitism, most graphically, since you were the object of someone beating you up. And I mean, it's not good to be beaten up or be beaten over the head or whatever with an umbrella, but I think it's worse to be beaten up and accompanied by, Jews to the ovens, or you're just a no good Jew, or whatever was the remarks. It leaves a much more indelible impression, I would think, far beyond the bruises, physical bruises, which heal. So what I want to talk about with you is um, you're unique. I don't mean unique that you're the only one, but you're the lens in which you have studied, taught, published about the Holocaust, which is something that recognizes the unique aspect of it involving gender, women. You describe yourself as a feminist, among other things. And until we talked before the show, or when we talked before the show, I told you that I, who consider myself to be reasonably well read on the topic, never really thought about the difference experience and the different analysis of the female experience through the Holocaust. And I mentioned I can now sort of get that, because in ethnic cleansing, terrorist atrocities that occur throughout the world today, one of the things that seems to be the most not only reprehensible but hard to understand is there always seems to be a fair amount of rape and degradation of women, even bound up in other political elements, other reasons why terrorism occurs. And I know I never quite understood why those two things seemed regretfully to be going hand in hand. So I want you to talk about the special place in your teaching and writing and experience about females in the Holocaust.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's again, it goes back to when I started when I talk about the Holocaust, I go, like I give talks, and often people ask about, why did it happen? It's the classic question of why did it happen? And my answer to that is usually, I think it's the wrong question to ask, because why does a genocide happen? It's sort of like, is there any reason one can give that could actually say, okay, I get it. There's just, it's beyond comprehension, because genocides are absolutely, wars are terrible, but genocides are truly, my mind still can't wrap around the horror of a genocide. The genocide is the most despicable, horrible, heart-wrenching. I mean, it's beyond. You do something to a group of people who cannot defend themselves. It's not a war. Genocide is against a group, a defenseless group. You just go after them to liquidate them, to just get rid of them. I hope, maybe
it's war on steroids, and I get your point.
Yes,
just to make a small subscript here.
God forbid.
In a war, somebody either starts a war or defends a war, and it's about territory. You've got land that belongs to me,
and it's horrible.
We don't like that, so it's a bad way of resolving differences. But there's a cause and effect issue there, or lack of political representation. We understand that, but as you say, when you add into the war, or even outside of the war, because genocides have occurred outside of war, the idea of killing, cleansing, getting rid of, that just doesn't seem to make much sense in terms of the way we view cause and effect of things.
And also because they are intestinal, internal to a nation, from the perspective of the victims. And that's kind of, we have to imagine what it means when all of a sudden your entire country, your neighbors, the place where you live, where you grew up, where your great-grandparents lived and grew up, all of a sudden they're after you for the killing. Not just they don't like you, they're actually, maybe so that we never experience that, but it must be something beyond actually words. I mean, it's just so horrible. So I've been wondering, of course, about this so much. I mean, through the years, like why, how, and the thing is, it didn't happen in a vacuum. The Holocaust doesn't just happen. It took a long time. It has very deep roots. It's very explainable. It's not surprising at all. The same way in which when we look at other atrocities, they're also not surprising. So I got to the idea, why shouldn't it be surprising? because if we look at them in the context of our civilization, and I'm just talking here about the West, which is what I know Europe, I know kind of the Western Christian, white, European civilization. It's the same all over, but I'll just stick to where I come from, not to offend anybody. When we look at patriarchal society, this makes, in fact, sadly, perfect sense. Genocides are really the result of this extreme intolerance of otherness. I mean, it's like kind of, you can't stand otherness to the point that you want to eradicate it to the last. And so in which other occasions has our world, our patriarchal world, shown us this kind of control freakness, this need of controlling, oppressing, micromanaging? It's in the world of women, for example. I mean, since always, women's bodies, women's minds, women's liberties, everything have been, and I'm talking about, I mean, from the caveman to today, have been kept under control. So
we never talk about cave women, it's always cave men, but go ahead.
Right, talking about the importance of words, right? And genocide is actually, this is a wonderful line from a scholar. Her name is Felstiner. She once said, and this is, I'd like that on a t-shirt, it says, genocide is the act of putting women and children first. And it's true, because genocide, again, unlike wars, and wars have rules. Now, these rules might be, followed or not followed, but wars have rules, genocides don't. But the one thing, the one idea behind a genocide, as the word itself says, is to attack the root itself of a genetic line, of a group of people. So you go for the women first. If you want to eradicate, you go for the kind of source of life within that particular group. So women become central targets of this hate. And in general, it's this idea that it's just so much like, for example, when you look at racism, and of course, anti-Semitism is a subcategory of racism for sure, you will spot sexism immediately also there. Women come up all the time. When you look at the history of patriarchal behavior towards femaleness, you keep seeing certain connections to other historical problems and misbehaviors. So for example, the role of gender being so central in like in the racist division of the world. So for the superior, in air quotes, of course, superior race, the women, they are idolized as the necessary reproducers of the superior race, right? So the Aryan race. So they're idolized, they're put on a pedestal. And the women of the inferior race, on the other hand, of course, they are vilified. They have to be punished, they have to be humiliated, they have to be killed, in fact, because they're culpable for the multiplication of the hated race. And and actually I should say here, for your listeners, for whoever, trigger warning, when we talk about this stuff, it's brutal, and I am sorry, there is really no way to tiptoe around these subjects, and I apologize with people out there. Be forewarned that it's brutal what's coming up, but we cannot talk about the treatment of women in society in general and the treatment of women in the situation of genocide without talking about rape. Rape as a tool of war. It's as old as human society itself, and it's a way of humiliating man, of the enemy, the male enemy. Of course, you take that, because again, women always have to belong to men. So you want to take something that belongs to your enemy, you take their women. You take the woman. What do? You let them see why you rape them. Again, in genocide, you kill them because because you want to kill the particular race you're after.
You don't want the perpetuation of the population.
Of
But
that
something
particular-
that you're saying, it strikes me just for a moment here, is to the extent even that the so-called superior race idolizes or puts on a pedestal women, and the inferior race is looked upon as being demonized. The part that's still in there, that's central to both, is looking at women by their function, by their principle, most important, if not exclusive function, which is to bear children. Whereas, it's horrible and bad and can't be defended and so on and so forth, that males, for example, African-American slaves were lynched primarily. But by the same token, African-Americans were presumably, women were also killed, but they were also raped. They were also, by their slave masters, they were also denigrated, and because of their femaleness. And I guess that's part of what you're getting at.
Absolutely, absolutely. So the female body is this territory for, degradation, humiliation, is where you hit when you want to, whatever, kind of make a case for your supremacy. And it happens all the time. And I mean, I have so much to say about this, because one of the things, as you were actually mentioning now, it's one of the horrifying things about rape and the experience of rape, and rape in all situations, from slavery, genocide, war, just in general society, is that women, it's so hard to make it count, because then associated with femaleness, there's also the idea of, the temptress, that women use their body to get what they want. And so, for example, after the war, and if you're familiar at all with memoirs or all the testimonies of Holocaust survivors that go around talking, in synagogues and JCC and so on, including female slave narratives, for example, in memoirs, rape is rarely mentioned. In fact, it's never mentioned, because women were afraid, particularly in the past, in the traditional societies that hopefully we left behind. Because the thing is, did you like it? Did you want it? Or were you using your body to get some favors or to survive? The few women, because fewer women survived the war, actually, the concentration camps, than men, but those who survived, they were looked at strangely by the relatives or people that maybe were in New York waiting for them, because how come you made it and not the men who are usually stronger, faster, whatever, they're men.
And the thinking behind that was what?
What did you do? Right? There's always this little, like, sometimes subtle, sometimes not, accusation of what did you do to get your freedom, right? And so, and it's absurd. This is absurd, and this is what women have to go through. The whole history, the whole story of what the Russians did when they advanced into Germany, as they were winning the war, and what they did to German women. I mean, there was a rape rampage in Berlin once the Russians arrived that was not talked about, because, of course, the German women were, in that case, the losers of the war. They were the enemy. And there were, whether they were Nazis or not, it doesn't matter. It's just there were women, they were there, and the Russians did something that is absolutely should have been, it's a crime against humanity, but it was really unnoticed and not talked about until very recently, when scholars started saying, well, I don't know about that. But it is this constant thing, and this is also the problem that patriarchal society has with homosexuality. Is kind of, the problems are never lesbians, because you don't need consent with women. It doesn't matter whom they like, what they prefer. It's always with homosexual gay men, because they actually endanger the reproductivity of the race, of the group, of their society. And it's insane, but it's unfortunately what we've been living with for thousands of years. And again, the Holocaust comes within this society. A society that thinks in terms of superiority and inferiority, a society that just it cannot accept diversity within itself, it's colonial, it's again, it's phallic, it's oriented towards just this constant violence rather than understanding and cohabitation. So,
well, I want to return to get very specific about the lens again for looking at the Holocaust with the issues of women and how women are looked upon, were looked upon. But let me, again, for those just tuning in, my guest today is Professor Federica Schoeman, who is associate professor, but also the director of Jewish Studies at the University of South Carolina. We've been talking about the Holocaust, and we've been talking about genocide, and we're starting to talk a little bit more specifically about, you use the term, Federica, the patriarchal nature of it. But I'm curious, I know that you and a number of other scholars, mostly women, participated in a symposium not too long ago, talking about, again, women and the Holocaust in particular. But I'm guessing, and the references I saw, that bringing up those topics at various times was probably pretty scary amongst Jewish folks, who said probably something along the lines of, well, this isn't really important, it's tangential. Again, you're diminishing the way in which the Holocaust affected everybody without being gender specific. But somehow I'm understanding that you guys, wrong use of the term, female scholars, people that were emphasizing this, have prevailed, and they've gotten their point across, or maybe they haven't. So why don't you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, all right. So this is a great question. Thank you for asking, because it's interesting. Also, let me just start by saying that yes. So this is why it matters to look at the history and experience of women within our society, within societies in general, because again, even within the subgroups of the hated groups, you will see misogyny. So in other words, like there is misogyny within the Jewish fold, there is misogyny within any, so, Jewish women had a problem and have a problem both as Jews and as women. And it's the same, I guess, for, as you brought before, the African-American experience, same thing with Black women, I'm sure. It's sort of like if you're hyphenated and part of that, thing is a woman, then you have a problem also because you have an entire misogynistic world against you all the time. And then you add just layers of hate to that, which could be your race, your religion, your sexuality, social status, for that matter, whatever it is. So, and yes, it's been really problematic. Historians are, as always, like traditionally male. I mean, women making it into academia, it's a thing of the 70s. It's that recent. And yes, it was, and I have to say this, last week, unfortunately, we lost the mother of Holocaust feminist studies, Joan Ringelheim. She was actually the very first scholar who raised the question of like, well, shouldn't we actually look specifically at the experience of women during the Holocaust? And that, caused a, hellstorm at the time and for the, subsequent 35 years, because male scholars were and are very resistant to that idea. And we have been pointing out over and over that it's not an issue. It's absolutely not a matter of creating a hierarchy of suffering. Everybody suffered in the Holocaust. It's not about that. It's not about taking away anything from, men or no. It's just to say, well, let's just look at the specifics, because if we want to be serious about reconstructing as faithful as possible image of what people went through in those years, then we have to really look at the experience of, the gender experience. So during the Holocaust, women again, first of all, as women, they were at a disadvantage, right? I mean, particularly, again, in society of those days, either you were, you know, just to simplify here, but there were poor Jewish women, ultra-Orthodox women, somewhere in the Städtlach, right, in the small Jewish villages in Central Eastern Europe. And those women generally just spoke Yiddish, they were poor, they were very chaste. And for them, for example, having to go into hiding was generally not an option. First of all, they didn't know the local languages, Polish, Ukrainian, whatever it was, Czech. Secondly, to take off their wigs, right, their religious head coverings was also a problem. So there were problems. They sound small, but they were huge at the time when it made the difference between, you know, life or death. They were at a disadvantage that way. They had been kept kind of separated on their own in these villages. And when a situation where you have to be more worldly and, you know, get around, save yourself, that could have been a great hindrance. Then you have rich women, bourgeois women in the big towns, Vienna, Berlin, Warsaw. Well, you know, the leisurely middle-class woman, she's a woman, she also stays home. Her husband is the one who reads the newspapers, who's out in the marketplace and gets information. So
a worldly person.
Or worldly, right? Is the guy who's outside, you know, while the home, the domestic sphere is the sphere of the woman that also puts you at a disadvantage. Women, we read this over and over in the memoirs, you know, of survivors, particularly people that were children, teenagers during the war. You will see this over and over in their accounts that they say 9 times out of 10, my mother got hysterical and she wanted to leave. And father said, no, let's wait. Don't be hysterical. You're exaggerating. You always panic. Let's wait it out. You know, it's this idea also that women are not listened to. Women understand nothing of politics. Women don't have the purse of the house. So even if they want to go, they really don't. They can't go to an embassy and say, give me a visa for me and my child, because of course they need the signature of the husband and the father. So women are also trapped in different ways in situations of extreme danger in these traditional societies. You know, nowadays, hopefully it would be different, at least in our part of the world. Once women were brought to the concentration camps, there was a different treatment there for women and men. And granted, and I'll never tire to repeat this, surviving the Holocaust was only an issue of luck. There was nothing else involved. There wasn't that one person was smarter than another, or that one person was favorite to God than another. It was just sheer luck, surviving the odds, the impossible odds that you were up against. However, the chances of somehow being lucky even were fewer for women than for men. Men who made it to a concentration camp in a physical state that allowed them to work, whatever that work was, you know, it was not work, whatever it was. And even then you could be called, your name could be up for, you know, for the gas chamber, you were up, that's it, you were done. They killed you, but you had a chance, you stood a chance. Women who went to the concentration camps and were between the ages of, young children were all sent to the gas, right? So there was an age selection, like 14, etc. You had to die. So what that left were women between the ages of 18 and on. And for the female group to be between the ages of 18 and 40 in those days meant that you had children or you were pregnant. When the trucks or the trains arrived to the death camps, men and women were divided. Men were selected for death or work based on their physical state and their age. Women were selected for death or work based on their physical state, their age, and their maternal status. Pregnant women were immediately gassed, and women with children were sent to the gas with their children. Mengele, the
Doctor, the
doctor,
experiment,
the
in
infamous
quotation
doctor,
marks, right?
right, of Auschwitz. He said that that was his policy, because he said no mother would want to see her child die and not die with him or her. An ironic joke, of course, again, by the Nazis. So, for example, a 26-year-old healthy woman who got to the concentration camps was more likely to be killed, to be murdered on the spot, because she was with child, or had some children with her, that and that is already right there. The odds were stacked so much, horribly against women. The women's barracks were in the worst position. For example, in Auschwitz, they were by the crematoria. And from a psychological point of view, that also had a great impact on the capacity of mental survival, even for the people there, being there, subjected to the smell, the sight of the corpses being brought there, the ashes falling on them, the humiliation of women. When they arrived, they were shaved entirely. Their bodies were shaved by men. And for a traditional, chaste, religious woman, for any woman, look, it doesn't even matter. That is such a humiliating thing to go through, right? And so again, like it's this thing where it's not so much, we're not saying that women had it worse. We're just saying, let's look at the experience of women and see how, again, these affected people differently, to understand it's monstrosity, right?
Right. They were treated differently. First of all, let me again reintroduce my guest. You're listening to Professor Federica Schoeman, the Director of Jewish Studies at the University of South Carolina. And we're talking about a difficult subject. We're talking about the situation or the unique circumstances for women during the Holocaust. And we might have a few minutes, hopefully, to talk about how some of those issues are still with us today outside of the context of the Holocaust. But what you're saying is, if you're going to be killed during the Holocaust, you're going to be killed, whether you're a man or woman. It's still the end result, you can say, is the same. Absolutely. But the experience of it and what it said in terms of the perpetrators, but also the imagery that it left for the survivors is different because of the differences associated with men and women, which go back outside of the Holocaust, part of the Holocaust, and are there today. Women, are unique, but the uniqueness of their reproductive responsibilities and family responsibilities seems to be what stands out whenever issues come up that affect the rights and the standing and the evaluation of women, and less so when it comes to putting women in parity with respect to wages and voting and other sorts of things. So I'm curious to understand how your students who are learning about, again, the unique aspects of gender with respect to the Holocaust, how do you see them reacting to the information? How do you see, in terms of their questions and the way they respond to essays and so on and so forth, how is that making a difference?
Yeah, I really hope so. My students are very surprised. They're not taught, they're not used to thinking about these kind of more complicated layers, right? Again, they know it's a genocide. Genocides are bad, and then I don't know exactly what they expect when they come into my classroom at the beginning of the semester, but usually the responses are very positive, and they say, well, you completely changed the way I look at the world, because again, I bring up things that are so much beyond the Holocaust itself, right? I mean, again, to understand the Holocaust, not as this freakish event that all of a sudden caught us all by surprise, oh my God, and then it's over, but it's something that should have been seen 2,000 years before. It made perfect sense, and the kind of world that allowed for the Holocaust to happen was the kind of world that was still there intact after the Holocaust. And this is why the repetition of these crimes and this mentality is because we haven't broken the mentality that gave us the Holocaust. And that's the biggest problem. There is no teaching the Holocaust without, I mean, effectively, without teaching about the mistakes of the mentality that birthed it. Otherwise, what are we talking about? We're just talking about gory, you know, see, okay, corpses, deaths, horrible. It doesn't do anything effectively, I mean, to change and to transform the world. One thing I do towards the end of the semester too, I connect the Holocaust and feminism, the treatment of women in the history of the male world, to ecology. What's the ecocide that is happening today is very well understandable. It's explainable in terms of feminism. You know, women are always associated with nature, men with rationality and the mind. So the same rape that is allowed, understood as a tool for power and supremacy used against women is the one that is used by men against nature, the environment. We have the same kind of empathy as a society and understanding of, you know, and lack of respect and awe of nature, the same way in which we have it for anything that is, you know, like other to us, that is defenseless, and that we can, you know, just somehow take over, destroy, and manipulate and get our anger out on, you know, so kind of completely our vengeance on. So it's all part of the same, we are still the same society that the Holocaust. You know, it's the same that is now doing the ecocide, and that has done the, you know, the Khmer Rouge or the, you know, Darfur. We're there. That's why this keeps repeating, because we haven't changed our way of thinking. We haven't integrated solidarity in our society that would allow us to just be on the side of the others without eliminating them, without, you know, suffocating their voices and agency. So I think my students really, again, they might not remember when they leave my classroom the year Hitler took power, or when did the first train arrive to Auschwitz, because I don't go in depth into that. I really give them this large kind of, you know, the larger picture. I try to tell them, look, this is how we talk about these things, right? We keep talking, particularly in America, we keep talking about the lessons of the Holocaust, hope, you know, whatever, even put God into the picture. This is not a medieval tale of martyrdoms and saintitude. It's not about that. It's this stuff happened in a society that was civilized, that was, you know, the nomenclatura of the Nazis, they all had PhDs. These were people that were highly educated. And yet, you know, they didn't see any contradiction in being great family fathers and, you know, at night, and then at 9 o'clock, go to a concentration camp where children of their own children's age were being crammed into gas chambers and burned into ovens. So obviously there is something that neither education can do per se, not just a piece of paper that makes you a humane person. It's really about understanding what we're doing wrong in our society when we oppress, reject otherness, and are so like, and this violence we apply to our relationship with the other to us, racial other, sexual other, religious other, and so on. And that's really what I think, I don't know, hits a very important chord with my students. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to ask you a question. We have, you know, 5 or 6 minutes left in the interview, and there's a tremendous amount that we haven't been able to cover. So we'll have you back to talk about some other things. But I want to ask you if you're willing to talk about lessons, again, learned in our society today. And I'm going to bring up a couple, and you may choose or not choose to speak about it based upon, you're a historian, you're not a lawyer, you're not a politician, thankfully. So we have a few issues that seem to be continuing to take front and center shape. And one of them is, I'm not going to use the word abortion, I'm going to use reproductive rights. And there is a mentality on the one side that says that the state, God, the Supreme Court, whatever, should have a primary role that, quote, trumps the decision making of women about whether to conceive or not to conceive. And there's a bunch of stuff I'm insisting, we don't have time to get into it, that are rolled up in that. Like you mentioned before about, did a woman who was raped, there's always a question of, did she ask for it? Was she looking for it? I think that part of the concern that people who are, quote, anti-abortion have is, you got pregnant. We don't care how you got pregnant. You could have, quote, just decided not to be pregnant. And the way you could have decided is to just be celibate, because we're not sure that we're even happy about, contraception. But it seems to me that that is another element. And I don't know if you ever get into that in your discussions, your classes, and so on and so forth, about how some of these issues continue to persist in our own society.
Yeah, I actually a little less about that. I think the students, because of everything we talk about, and we talk about, actually, we were saying before about, again, women in death camps. I mean, those who were pregnant but were not detected, they didn't say it, or the selection at the selection line that was, or they didn't know perhaps even at the time. You can only imagine what it meant to be pregnant for a woman in those days in a concentration camp. It meant that they had to find a woman doctor, prisoner, and who had to somehow, they had to hide the pregnancy and help the women at night give birth and then kill the child. Or these mothers who had to smother their children because, again, it was because women and children are always put together in one category of basic of non-legal subjects. They are not, their testimonies didn't count in court. Like children, women and children are always lumped together for a reason, because women are infantilized like children. They are, right? So, and so I don't quite need to go into the specifics, right? My students know exactly what I'm talking about when I'm talking about this larger, things about history and the Holocaust. But yes, definitely, we talk about the way in which, again, as you say, the issue of the abortion rights has got so much to do with male supremacy over the female body. And not only that, but unfortunately, I do believe more than anything else, because of my family, the way I was brought up, I believe, and I'm ready to die for a secular state. In Europe, at least, since the French Revolution, we really tried to keep church and state separate for this reason. And if you pay attention to the discourses of people who, it's a religious issue. It's not a medical issue. It's really a religious issue. It's like, and that's wrong to begin with. So yes, as you say, this care, they're going to say that it's about life. It's about caring for life. Except that the same people contradictorily then, when the life is actually there and breathing and talking and crawling around, that life can be murdered for, I don't know, holding marijuana in their pockets, or because, the color of their skin.
Right.
In prison,
It's right. It's the having of the child, not the child.
Yeah. So
okay.
It's as long as the child is in the body of the woman and that right. power can be taken away from a woman, then we legislate. Anything right. else, they can right. go to hell.
Because that's the woman's job. Well, I got to tell you, we had so much more to cover, but this has been so interesting. I want to thank my guest, Professor Federica Schoeman, who's the Director of Jewish Studies at the University of South Carolina, for a fascinating discussion. much more to talk about, but I've gotten it since this discussion and in our pre-interview. So thank you again for being on the show today.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you so much.
Certainly.